Okay, so we've got 3 more components to go over: the J checkbox, the J radio button, and the combo box. And in the license agreement program that we just looked at in the previous video, we introduced the use of the checkbox. So let's take a closer look at that. A J checkbox component displays a small square with a label at its right. When the square is blank, the checkbox is unselected. When the square contains a check mark, the checkbox is selected. I'm sure you've seen this 1,000 million times. Users click on the checkbox in order to toggle it between selected and unselected. To create a J checkbox component, call the J checkbox constructor like this. The label argument specifies the text that will appear, and the selected will tell you if it's checked or not, right? So here's an example. Here we have creating a new J checkbox, and we're using the text select me, and we're saying you are not selected by default. If the label argument is omitted, then no text appears at the right of the checkbox square. Additionally, if the selected argument, which is a Boolean value, if it's blank, it will automatically be defaulted to false as well, right? So if we declare it like that, that's what we're going to get, just a box. And like we've seen before, there's a lot of common methods that are used, so let's go ahead and take a look at those. Right? Is selected will tell you if the checkbox is selected or not. Set selected, which will actually check it or uncheck it. Set visible sets the visibility. Enabled, can the user actually click on it? Is it enabled, right? And then finally, we can add an action listener, so when you click on the box, it will do something besides check the check, right? With a standard J button, you almost always want to have an associated listener. However, you may or may not want to have a listener for a checkbox. So as in this case here. In this example, we have an event listener for the custom installation that enables the checkboxes. The checkboxes don't have an action listener attached to them, as they are purely input to the installation program. So as a general rule, you're going to want to use a listener if you want something to happen immediately, right when the user checks or unchecks the checkbox. And if there's no listener, then the checkbox simply serves as an input entity. If that's the case, then the checkbox's value, whether it's checked or unchecked, would typically get read and processed when the user clicks another button. So in this case, the user would click on continue, and then it would do something by assessing what options that you had selected and determining something else, right? So now that we showed you the radio buttons in the previous example, let's see how they're implemented. A J radio button component displays a small circle with a label to its right, just like the checkbox. When the circle is blank, the radio button is selected, and when the circle contains a dot, then the radio button is selected. The primary difference between a radio button and a checkbox is that a radio button almost always comes in groups. Within a radio button group, only one radio button can be selected at any given time. If an unselected button is clicked, the click button becomes selected, and the previous selected button in the group is unselected. If a selected button is clicked, then no change occurs, i.e. the clicked button will remain selected. Creating a J radio button component is very similar to the checkbox. Simply call the J radio button constructor like this, right? The label specifies the text that appears to the right of the button, just like our checkbox, right? And if the label argument is omitted, then no text appears. The selected argument is a Boolean value that specifies whether the radio button is initially selected. If the selected argument is omitted, then the radio button is initially unselected. If we return to our installation options example, we would create the radio buttons like this. Here you can see we are creating 2 radio buttons, and then we are instantiating them. We're actually declaring them, right? And then we are instantiating them with new down here. And here's the text, right? And here's the selected. And notice that this has no selected parameter, so it's false by default. Now, the primary difference between normal implementation of a radio button and a checkbox is that radio buttons usually belong to a group, like I said before. To enable the only one button selected at a time functionality of a radio button group, you create a button group object and add individual radio button components to it, like this. Right here, we create a button group reference. It's a reference variable, and we create a new button group, and then we just simply call add on that whatever we name that button group to be, and we pass in the button that we created beforehand. So in our previous example, we had the standard and custom buttons. So here we created the radio button group, and then we added in our standard and custom buttons. As with all of the other components, let's go over the list of methods that you can use with the J radio button. So we've got isSelected, which will tell you if the radio button is selected or not. Remember, we apply this to the radio button, not the group. We also have setSelected. So if you call this on one of the buttons in the group, the other buttons in the group will automatically default to false, right? We can also set the visibility, and we can set it to be enabled. And finally, we can add an action listener, so we can take whatever other functionality we want to add to it. Okay, so now we've got one more component to go over, and that is the J combo box component. A combo box allows the user to select an item from a list of items. Combo boxes are sometimes called drop-down lists because when you click on the combo box's down arrow, a list of selection items drop down. After a selection is made, the item list disappears and only the selected item is displayed. However, there is a difference. Combo boxes are called combo boxes because they are a combination of a text box, normally they look like a text box, and a list. When the down arrow is clicked, they look like a list. Combo boxes and radio button groups are similar in that they both allow the user to select one item from a list of items. But a combo box takes up less space on the window. So if you have a long list of items to choose from, like say, states, you have a field or something you want to populate, and you want to save space, you're going to use a combo box rather than a group of radio buttons. So how do you work this UI magic? Well, mostly like all the other components. But first we need to create an array of list options. Right? So here we're creating the string days, an array of string days, and we're just populating it with Monday through Friday, right? And then we create a combo box object by passing the array into the combo box constructor. So here we've got our days box, and we pass in our days array to the combo box as part of its constructor. And like everything else, here's a list of common methods, right? So we've got set visible, set editable, get selected items. These two things are new, right? Get selected items will return the item that is currently selected. So when you select it from the dropdown, so usually you might attach this with an action listener. So after a user selects it, you might add an action listener that's going to call get selected item and process that in some way. Or you could additionally set the selected items, programmatically instead of relying on the user to do it. You might want to select the different item based on some other fields in the form or on the GUI, right? Note that this returns an object, right? So if you're using classes and you want to set something, you might have to cast the object to the appropriate class that you want to work with. And then of course we have an action listener, or add action listener if we want to add our own behavior to it. Okay, so our last demo of this video and chapter. Here we have our usual import statements, and we can tell that we're going to have an action listener that's going to be used in an action event, as evident by the awt.event import. And then we got the usual job application, the sizes, we're setting the sizes, then we're creating a bunch of reference variables that we're going to assign to objects later, right? We've got a couple checkboxes, and we've got a combo box and a button, right? Then we got the usual constructor where we're going to set the title and the width and all that, and then we're going to call the create content. So all that should be familiar to you at this point, right? So And the constructor's got a couple comments in here, but we're going to just look at this and say, okay, we've got a panel called a window panel, right? And it's setting a new border layout, and this is the horizontal gap, and this is the vertical gap. And then we are setting it in a creating a empty border. We're setting the border, so we've got a 10 pixel margin, right? And what the author is talking about here is, in Java, this is top left bottom right. So top left bottom right, where if you're working with HTML a lot, we often use this trouble acronym for how borders are set and attributes are applied in CSS, which is cascading style sheets, and TRBL is top right bottom left. So it's a bit different with Java than CSS, so he's just making a note of that. We are creating a center panel, and we're using a grid layout, so it's going to be 11 by 1, right? And then we need a panel for a button so it can be center aligned, he says. So we're creating a south panel, and he's using a flow layout, right? And then we're creating a new checkbox. So we're saying, hey, are you a certified programmer? Do you have help desk experience? We're creating another checkbox for coffee, right? Are you good to make coffee? And you'll see once this is all put together why and what he's talking about. Radio buttons. Okay, he's got 2 different radio buttons. Are you a good citizen or are you a criminal? And then he creates a radio button group, and he adds those 2 radio buttons to the radio group. Then he creates a combo box of type string, and here he creates a new anonymous string array object, and he passes in the values of these, wage ranges, right? And then he creates a submit button, and he adds an action listener to that. I don't know why test is here. Get rid of that. And then in the center panel, he goes through and he adds all of these things to the center panel, right? So this is kind of like the setup, right here, and this is applying all of them to the panel, okay? And then for the window panel, he adds the center panel to the border layout center position. And then in the south panel, he adds the submit button. And then he adds the south panel to the south layout. So remember, we've got 2 different panels here. We've got the main window panel, and then we've got these other panels that he's creating to apply to the different border layouts, okay? And then we haven't seen this in a while, but he has his action listener, button listener class. It's implementing the action listener interface, and he just says, hey, if this is where we're using those buttons or the checkboxes as values, right? So he's saying, hey, if Java is selected or help desk is selected or coffee is selected, so if any one of those 3 items is checked and you're a good citizen, and if salary is not above 100,000, then show you this message right here. Otherwise, say, sorry, no jobs at this time, right? And that's what this whole program does. So if we compile it and we run it, here's the program, right? So it says, hey, check all these boxes, right? You can check any of them. So if any of them are checked, and you say you're a law-abiding citizen and you pick one of these 2 values and hit submit, it will prompt with this message dialog that says, thank you for your application. We'll contact you at a later time. If I say, hey, I'm a violent criminal, guess what? You get a different message. Sorry, no jobs at this time. If I say, I've got none of those skills, but I'm a law-abiding citizen and I'm willing to work for cheap, you check the box. Look at that. No jobs at this time. Right? If I say, hey, I'm a certified programmer, and I click submit, look what it says. Sorry, no jobs at this time. So that's the program, and that's showing you how you can implement a button listener and use checkboxes to get information and to alter the flow of your program based on different conditions, right? So basically, you had to have some skill, you had to be a good citizen, and you had to be willing to work for less than $100,000 to get this to show up, right? Otherwise, they had no jobs for you.
Okay, and the rest of this is all, and I know it's a lot, but if you break it down into components, and this is where it really helps to sketch out ideas first, and then you can break it up into those individual components, right? You can say, well, hey, I can lay stuff out in this, border region layout, but I'm really only going to use maybe the top, middle, and center. I may not actually be using the left and right sides. Maybe you're doing that for spacing reasons or whatever. And then you can break it down so you can say, hey, my center panel is going to have all these options. My bottom panel is going to have the submit button, and so on and so forth, okay? So the more you work with it, the more it's the same. Yes, it seems like it's a lot of code, but once you get used to it, it really doesn't take you that long to create these things, okay? So that's the job application demo. And if you have any questions on any of this, be sure to ask in class.
Well, that's it for this round of videos. Hopefully you learned a little bit about GUI programming. Again, this is not going to make you an expert GUI programmer. It's giving you the basics and the tools to get started if you wanted to make your own Java-based GUI application. This is the materials that are presented in these last two chapters is more than enough to get you started on creating a lot of different things. And especially with everything else that you've learned over the course of this 8 weeks, you could actually build a pretty robust program as long as you have a defined requirement, right? You have to have an idea for what it is that you want to do, but you have more than enough tools in your toolbox now to actually create a program, and how good it looks and how well it responds and reacts is really up to how well you actually code it. Do you do input validation? If you have a text field, what do you do? What do you allow to users to submit? Can they put in values that are out of range? Does your program logic make sense? So everything that you've learned up to now all comes together when it comes to writing these GUI programs for that type of interaction. So hopefully you learned a lot, and we'll go over final review for the exam, and that's about it. That's all I got this week. So thank you.